Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be discussing a widely controversial topic. What's more important? A more expensive, better GPU or a GPU that might be a little lower cost but have a little more VRAM? So really, what is VRAM? That's what we need to know first. Well, it's the module that you're seeing on the screen. It's these little black spots here, and these are Virtual Random Access Memory Modules, VRAM. So you know how your computer system has RAM, Random Access Memory Modules, and they're all on that stick? That stick is a PCB. Well, these modules sit here. They're much faster than system memory. They're right and readily available to the graphics processing unit. So they're right there, ready to be used. And why do we need VRAM? Well, when you see the image displayed on your screen, your graphics processing unit is actually creating that image. First, your CPU is telling the GPU what it needs to render. The CPU makes the outline of what the image on your screen is going to look like. Your GPU renders frame by frame by frame using VRAM as its memory buffer for textures, for colors, for lighting. So when you load a game, then the GPU requests from the CPU to go to the hard drive and get the memory or whatever it needs to store for that game. And this creates seamless loading. So as you're walking around the map, say in Call of Duty Black Ops 3, because that's the example I'm going to use today, because that game uses a lot of system RAM and VRAM alike. But say you're walking around the map and you see a block load, like you actually see it. So it just looks like creamy pastel, and then all of a sudden it gets some texture, and say it's a brick. So first it just looks like a creamy pastel-y block, and then it turns into, it gets bumps and it gets cracks and stuff like it's supposed to as a brick. Well, that's being stored in this VRAM module, those textures that make it look like a brick, and even the colors. And how you might see it on your graphics card if you've never seen it on your graphics card before, but it could be on the back of the PCB or the front underneath the cooler, but it'll look like these. All these black modules here, those are VRAM on a graphics card. That's what they look like, and they're all the way around, and they surround right here, which is the graphics processing unit. No! Sorry, that was my dog. Anyway, so that's your memory buffer. Why, if VRAM is so important, then why do the textures still load, you might ask? Say they load late, but they still load. What has to happen is your GPU actually sends a fetch code to your CPU. So your graphics card is saying, I need such and such texture for such and such. And the CPU then goes and tells the hard drive or SATA controller, I need this and this. And then your hard drive has to go and search for it. If you have a mechanical drive, it's slower. If you have an SSD, it's faster. It's all about random read and write times. But it still takes time anyway. Even if you have an SSD, you will notice loading. Does VRAM affect frame rate? Yes and no. VRAM, when it's maxed out, is about the only time it actually affects frame rate and the speed. Another common misconception is that the faster your VRAM, the better. Not necessarily the more, you know. I disagree with that. You could have a little bit slower VRAM, but then have more, and your game would actually look better. But actually increasing the megahertz of the VRAM increases frame rate, because If your megahertz on your VRAM is slow, you're actually starving your graphics processing unit of needed information to move on and develop the next frame. So the higher your megahertz, the sooner or faster your VRAM can get rid of that information that's stored within it. So what's really more important, speed or quantity? I personally say quantity. Right now I have a GTX 950 2 gig because they didn't make a 4 gig, and they really should have in this card. I wish they would have made a 950 Ti, made it as a 4 gig, because in Black Ops 3 you use, if you allow it to go and max out, it'll use on 1080p, I think it's 5 gigs of VRAM and 5 gigs of system memory. And that's just storing all the textures. It's going to take, if it can, the entire map that you're playing on and store it all in the memory. So it's right there for your graphics card to use instead of sending a fetch code. And we're actually going to look at what that looks like. Now, I said earlier that the only time frame rate is actually affected is when the RAM is actually maxed out. And why is this? Well, your GPU, when it renders the frame, it's rendering pixel by pixel by pixel. So it's rendering up and down. Well, when it renders, it then sends and takes it to a small buffer in the VRAM and stores it there. So part of the VRAM has to be open just for a frame. And no matter what, a frame is always going to be stored in VRAM before it gets sent to your monitor. Otherwise, you would see a lot of times it would probably look like screen tearing that you kind of can eliminate with VSync. And then, so it always stores that frame buffer, and in a lot of graphics card settings you can go into NVIDIA settings even and set your frame buffer higher, but that means you need more memory. So I figured out that you need roughly 250, 256, we'll just make it an even number, but that's relatively how much how many megabytes you actually need to store about one frame to be flawless. Have smooth frame rate, no stuttering. And I'll show you what stuttering looks like too, because some people might think it's lag. It is not lag, it's not your CPU, it's your RAM on your GPU. What's a good rule of thumb for graphics cards? A good rule of thumb is, well, for minimum you can probably play 1080p on 2 gigs, which is what I do now, 1440 on 3 gigs, and 4K on 4 gigs. Those are bare minimums. You will run into bottlenecks, such as in Black Ops 3, in certain games, and you will get stuttering. What do I say is a rule of thumb for how much VRAM you actually need? I say double the numbers. 4 gigs for 1080, 6 gigs for 1440, and 8 gigs for 4K. Those are truly the numbers you need to flawlessly play the game. And there is a big difference between drops in frame rate, just a natural drop in frame rate, and stutter. And they're very noticeable if you know what you're looking for. But right now I'm going to show you texture loading. I'm going to show you the problem with texture loading first. So here we've got, in Black Ops 3, we've got our, these are the settings. These are what I have to play at to make the game look as good as it can with zero stuttering. Zero whatsoever. So texture quality at medium. Texture quality is the different textures on the items that are loaded. Texture filtering, I'm not 100% sure what texture filtering does, but it does create stress on the GPU, and really putting it on low, you don't notice a whole lot of performance difference. It doesn't look a whole lot different, and you get a few more frames out of it. Mesh quality is how round objects and corners are. So if it's supposed to be a round, say it's a head, if you have it set on low, you'll get sides and slants. It's very noticeable. So I always set that to high. Shadow map quality. These are the different shadows of the objects around the map. I don't like. Low looks terrible. It looks very blocky. Medium starts looking good, and high looks really, really good. I don't really see the difference between high and extra, but there is a huge performance difference. Dynamic shadows are shadows that follow moving objects in the game, so like a shadow that might follow a player. Subsurface scattering, it's just better lighting for faces and the faces of objects and stuff. Order independent transparency, I have no idea what that does, but it is hella stressful. Anti-aliasing, that basically gets rid of all the jagged lines you see on different objects and transitions and stuff. I always put that as high as I can. Ambient OCK, don't really know what that does, don't really care. It's very stressful again on the GPU. And motion blur. What motion blur does is around the edges of the screen, it blurs it out a little bit just so it doesn't hurt your eyes and your eyes don't get dry over time. So these are my settings, and this is what it looks like. See the blockiness of the shadows? That's one issue. And then if you look over at the trees, see how the leaves, there isn't a whole lot of texture there. It doesn't look that good. But it's the only way I can get it with zero stutter. This next one is low as I can get it. Everything set to low except for anti-aliasing and except for motion blur. And this is what it looks like. So you see down there, you got the shadows. Down here, the bad shadows, they're blocky. I don't like that. But then we see here, that flat edge that I was talking about. This rock is fairly round. But now we see that flat edge where when I dropped mesh quality, that's what happened. And if I walked around a little more, like you can see there, the textures aren't quite loaded in. That's pretty jagged. Yeah, it just goes with the territory. That is low. It doesn't look that good. Zero stutter, but whatever. This next one is, I basically took my settings and did two things. I bumped shadow map quality up to medium, so it makes the shadows look much better. This is the settings I try to play at. Texture quality I brought all the way up to high, which makes it look really, really good in game. And just kind of left everything else the same. And it looks like this. So we see now the textures are nice, crisp and clear. This tree is loaded in. It looks pretty crisp. I mean, it looks pretty good. I'd say that looks really good. I mean, we still got some jagged edges, but that just has to do with loading and stuff. Now we've got extra, high, high, and extra. Still no order independent transparency, and still no ambient OCK. And now what does it look like? Well, now we're starting to see some lower VRAM buffer. This is what happens when you don't have enough VRAM and you have your game settings set right. So you keep that frame buffer and it doesn't stutter as much. You get this. This is where a texture didn't load. It didn't load the cracks in the leaves, and it didn't load the facial texture of the leaf. And this happens to objects all around the map, not just this one tree. Alright, that was just on extra. Now we've got maxed out settings. Max as I can get them, and it's still, this looks even worse. Got no texture here. We've got, see, these leaves have kind of loaded in. It's only loading in what it can with the buffer we've got, which is 2 gigs. And then it hasn't loaded these in. And as I'll show right now, it's stuttering very hard. This is what stutter looks like, and this is why you should have at least 4 gigs on 1080p. And just watch this closely. You see that right there? All that? That's not frame rate. That's not dips in frame rate because of GPU stress. That is what lack of VRAM looks like. When you have a lack of VRAM and then it's loading those textures in, it's trying to get rid of enough so it can store that frame in there. And then it's also trying to go and load from the hard drive, and as soon as those textures load in like that, when those textures actually come and load in and they all hit the GPU like a brick wall, then you'll see your drops in frame rate. If you've got more than enough VRAM, you will see a consistent frame rate. It'll look like a flat line. It won't look like this. You'll see a similar situation in 4K. I tried to play this 2 gig card on 4K, and I ran into two problems. Sorry for the burp. I was sitting at 34 frames constant at low everything, and then the frame rates just went goom, 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 goom until it hit about 4 and 8 frames, somewhere in there. And it just crashed. It could not buffer. There was not enough buffer. And then I looked at my system RAM, and I had pegged system RAM because when you up your resolution, the way I look at it is the resolution you were playing at, you take, so say you're playing at 4K, 1080p is 2K, so take it times 2, whatever your frame buffer was, and that's your minimum. So your minimum, and then your maxes, or your, so 2 and 4 for 1080p, and 4 and 8 for 4K. That's how I look at it. 4K on this 2 gig card is unplayable. Maybe in an SLI configuration. I don't even think it can do that because the buffer is so small. And then system RAM, for 4K, so as we conclude that video, that's relatively VRAM for you guys. Enjoyed the video. If you want to see more content, more tutorials, or have any questions, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down in the comment section below. And until my next video, everybody on YouTube,